Cold of Moscow in 1821 seemed to hold a secret. The snow fell with the slowness of an omen. The world did not yet know it. Amid the silence of the streets and the creaking of carriages, a man was born, destined to cross centuries, not with swords, words. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky came into the world in an age of empires and inequalities, but his true battlefield would be invisible, the human mind. And, at some point in the future, a greater consciousness watched him, same one that would inspire another man to decipher the laws that govern destiny, Napoleon Hill. It was as if two spirits recognized each other across time, each with a different mission, but guided by the same question: what moves human beings when everything seems to be falling apart? From a young age, Dostoevsky learned that reality wasn't just walls and uniforms. He grew up surrounded by books, by faces that dreamed and suffered, by stories that seemed to breathe the weight of existence. His father, a doctor in a hospital for the poor, daily showed him the harshest side of life, the incurable pain, the nameless suffering. There, as a boy, Dostoevsky learned what Hill would later call the law of burning desire, not the pursuit of power or glory, but the drive to understand. The boy who saw the misery on the streets of Moscow began to wonder why some are born surrounded by light and others by darkness, why faith survives when reason is exhausted, why some men, even in ruins, continue to choose to live. These questions would become the foundation of his inner journey. He studied military engineering in St. Petersburg, rational, safe, predictable choice, the path of logic. But his soul refused to accept the cold calculation of measurements. Hill would say that there began the struggle between desire and fear, between the voice of the mind and the call of the Dostoevsky, like every man who hears himself for the first time, realized that following orders was living half a life. Engineering taught him rigor, but it was art that freed him. The military uniform was left behind, and the young Russian began to write with the urgency of someone translating the invisible. In 1846, he published Poor People, a book that stunned critics and the public. There were no grandiose heroes or exemplary victories, just ordinary people trying to exist. It was his first contact with what Hill would call the creative power of the subconscious mind, the ability to transform suffering into insight, failure into revelation. Dostoevsky didn't write to entertain. He wrote to survive. Every sentence was a confession, every character a mirror. He didn't seek literary glory. He sought to understand his own chaos, but life would not leave him alone. Sudden success brought admiration and envy, recognition and scrutiny. 19th century Russia was an empire on shaky foundations, and any thought that challenged the Tsar was seen as a threat. Dostoevsky approached a group of intellectuals who believed in social reform and freedom of expression. They discussed philosophy, justice, and faith-dangerous ideas for a country accustomed to blind obedience. It was the call of the collective conscience, a force Hill would define as the power of the mastermind, a meeting of creative minds that defied stagnation. Then came the coup. In 1849, soldiers stormed the house where they were meeting and took everyone prisoner. Dostoevsky was accused of conspiring against the empire. He was only 27 years old. He who dreamed of freeing the human soul was locked in a dark cell, cold, hungry, and afraid. But it was there that he discovered the truth that would guide the rest of his life. It is not the prison that defines a man, but what he does within it. And if Hill had been with him at that moment, he would have said the same thing he would write almost a century later: failure is merely a disguise for learning, and that the human mind, when touched by purpose, cannot be destroyed. It is said that on the eve of his execution, Dostoevsky looked up to the sky and realized how much he had ignored the miracle of simply existing. Every second became precious. Every breath was an eternity. He understood that life, even surrounded by death, was still a gift. This realization transformed him. When the Tsar, in a cruelly calculated gesture, pardoned the condemned at the last second, Dostoevsky was reborn, no longer as the young and ambitious writer, but as the man who had conversed with nothingness and returned to tell it. At that moment, Hill, even living in another century, seemed to whisper in his mind: what a man thinks, he becomes; what a man feels, he acts; and what a man believes, he creates. Dostoevsky didn't yet know these words. He already lived their essence. His pen would be the instrument of a greater mission: to reveal to the world that the true battlefield lies within the human mind, and that every thought is a force capable of making or destroying destiny. The young engineer who rejected calculus to write about the soul became the messenger of the collective unconscious. Every step he took after imprisonment was a note in the silent hymn of self-mastery. Hill would teach that wealth is born of mental clarity. Dostoevsky proved it through pain, not in coins, but in consciousness. Emerging from exile, he carried in his hands not only scars, but a new understanding of human nature. that no suffering is in vain if wisdom springs from it. Time shaped him, but truth guided him. He was beginning to understand that the mind is the mirror of God, and that when man courageously peers into his own abyss, he finds there the spark of creation. Dostoevsky may never have read Napoleon Hill, but the energy that united them was the same that drives all seekers: the conviction that thought is sacred and that every fall contains a revelation. Thus, from the cold of Moscow to the dungeons of Siberia, a man was born who learned what few dare to comprehend: that life is not meant to be conquered, but to be deciphered. And Hill, like a timeless voice, would echo through him, reminding him that true triumph lies not in conquering the world, but in mastering one's own. Dostoevsky didn't know it yet, but what awaited him more than literature. It would be the spiritual journey that would transform pain into light and despair into philosophy. The road to the subterranean soul was just beginning, and on the horizon, Hill's voice seemed to announce, defeat is the first rehearsal for victory. And so ends the first part, the birth of the man who learned to think with his heart and feel with his intellect. A man who carried, unknowingly, the same fire that Napoleon Hill would later call the power to transmute thought, destiny. There was still much to be revealed, because before understanding the world, Dostoevsky needed to face his own shadow. And what he would find there would forever change the way humanity understands itself. They say a man only discovers who he truly is when he loses everything. For Dostoevsky, this discovery began in the freezing dawn when the guards knocked on his door. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. The sound of boots mingled with the crackling wind, and before he could comprehend, he was handcuffed and dragged through the snow-covered streets. He was only 27 years old. The writer who dreamed of freeing consciences, now accused of treason against the empire. The cell was small, damp, the floor covered in dirty straw, the air thick with fear and silence. There he learned that the mind is the only territory no one can conquer. It was in this prison that Dostoevsky began to understand what Napoleon Hill would call the power of self-mastery, the ability to direct one's thoughts even when the body is a prisoner. For weeks he was interrogated, humiliated, threatened. The world he knew had crumbled, and yet in the darkness something in him resisted. Perhaps it was the same instinct that drives anyone faced with the unexpected, when everything seems to crumble, but an invisible force within us insists on remaining. Who hasn't felt this? The moment when life changes without warning. When a diagnosis, a loss, a bankruptcy, or a betrayal shatters the ground beneath our feet, and the only question remaining, what to do now? This was the question Dostoevsky asked himself as he faced the abyss. And it was with this question that his transformation began. The days blurred. Time lost its rhythm. With each dawn, hope faded a little more. Until one day, without warning, he and the other prisoners were taken to the central square. A death stage had been set up. Snow covered the ground like a white blanket, and the silence was so profound that hearts could be heard beating. The condemned were lined up before the platoon. 3 men were tied to the posts. Dostoevsky was in the next line, the next to die. He looked up at the sky for the last time and realized something he would never forget: how much life had been wasted on pride and haste. And if I survive, every minute will be an eternity of happiness. The moment the soldier raised his rifle, a messenger arrived on horseback, bearing a decree from the Tsar. The execution was suspended. The sentence had been commuted to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. Hell had become resurrection. Dostoevsky breathed as if reborn, and the world would never be the same again. The man who descended to the brink of death returned with a certainty that Napoleon Hill would later translate. Simple words: life is shaped not by events, but by how we react to. Siberia was a land of extremes: biting cold, constant hunger, silence that seemed to scream. Men slept piled high in wooden barracks, chains marking their ankles as a reminder of guilt. Dostoevsky, who had previously written about the human soul, now saw it naked, unmasked, reduced to survival. But it was there that he discovered the purity within. Among thieves, murderers, and the wretched, he also found compassion, forgiveness, faith. Those people whom society called lost taught him more about human nature than any book. He observed their gestures, their looks, their silences, and realized that within each man lay a universe of regrets and hopes. At night, as the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, Dostoevsky thought of Hill without knowing him, as if hearing a distant voice saying, "Defeat contains the seed of victory." The human mind is like a fire. When compressed by adversity, it becomes a flame, and it was this flame that kept him alive. He began to understand that misery is not the end, but the means by which the soul is honed. No greatness without trial, no wisdom without loss. This realization transformed his prison into a laboratory soul. How many times in life do we feel this way, trapped in seemingly hopeless situations? Draining job, a sickening relation that seems too distant. Dostoevsky learned that even in these invisible prisons, there is always a gap, an inner window that no one can close. Man may be deprived of freedom, never of the power to think. Hill would assert, a century later, that every man is master of his own destiny when he learns to master his mind. Dostoevsky discovered this by experiencing the opposite of freedom, finding meaning in the midst of despair. After years of suffering, he was finally free. The world had changed, and so had he. The streets of St. Petersburg seemed smaller, the people more hurried, life more fragile. He looked around and saw how much human beings flee from their own conscience, how much they seek distractions to avoid listening to what is within them. But Dostoevsky now saw beyond. He had known the limit and knew that nothing, not power, not glory, not reason, was worth more than the simple act of being. He began writing again, but his words were no longer the same. They had weight, density, and soul. He no longer spoke of characters. He spoke of the human condition itself. His books ceased to be literature and became mirrors. Each page reflected the conflict between spirit and flesh, between the ideal and the Napoleon Hill would call this the law of transmutation, transforming suffering into purpose, chaos into direction. And it is this law that also applies to all of us, in any age, in any downfall. Dostoevsky came to understand that the greatest prison is not one of iron, but that of fixed ideas, fear, and lack of faith. How many live like this, trapped in suffocating routines and thoughts that condemn them, pasts that won't release them? He discovered that the mind, when fueled by despair, creates its own cell, but when fueled by faith, it becomes a force capable of moving mountains. He emerged from Siberia poorer than when he entered, but infinitely more aware. He learned that life is a silent contract between man and his own soul. Either one learns to use it, or one is used by it. The return to St. Petersburg was a rebirth, but also a confrontation. People expected the same young idealist as before, but now he carried something different in his eye, a kind of profound calm, as if he had seen the end and understood that the end is just another beginning. He began writing again, and his words seemed to come from a place few had known. Each sentence contained the intensity of someone who had faced death and returned to tell the tale. It was as if Napoleon Hill were writing through him, teaching that failure is the invisible mold of victory, and that suffering, when accepted, transforms into wisdom. Dostoevsky now understood that the mind is the temple of creation, and that man, by thinking, becomes a co-author of his own story. No decree, no exile, no prison can steal this. And it was with this certainty that he began a new phase of his life, a journey that would lead him to write about the depths of the human soul, about crime and forgiveness, about freedom and guilt. The writer who had faced death would learn, in the following pages, that the greatest prisons have not bars, but names, pride, fear, and ignorance. And as the lights of St. Petersburg reflected on the Neva, Dostoevsky walked in silence, feeling something watching him, a subtle presence, like an ancient thought that still echoed. It was Napoleon Hill, reaching through time like an invisible mentor, whispering what he already intuited. The man who rules his own mind is freer than the rules empires. Life had given him a second chance, also a mission. And from that moment on, Dostoevsky would no longer just write books. He would build bridges between pain and awakening, between humanity and infinity. When Dostoevsky returned from Siberia, he was no longer the same man. Something in his gaze had changed, a kind of unsettling calm, as if carrying the weight of the invisible. The world seemed too noisy, too hurried, too small for someone who had once gazed into the abyss and survived. And it was from this distance that one of the most disturbing and revealing works in history was born. Memories, from underground book that isn't about characters, but about mirrors. A book in which the author, perhaps without realizing it, has transformed his own mind into a stagehand, human being into an enigma. That nameless man who speaks from the depths is more than a literary creature. He is the reflection of what is most secret in each of us. He is the unspoken thought, the resentment masquerading as reason, the pride masking pain. He lives isolated, not because the world rejected him, but because he rejected the world. He cannot bear the simplicity of ordinary life, neither can he bear the complexity. He is the portrait of modern man, even before modernity. Fragmented being, divided between conscience, instinct, between wanting and not knowing what he wants. Napoleon Hill, if he had observed him, would have said that this man is the mind without direction, a powerhouse without purpose. The human mind, when unaided, turns against itself. It's like a blade spinning in the void, cutting the very hand that holds it. Dostoevsky knew this. That's why when he created the underground man, he wasn't describing a lunatic, common citizen, one who lives surrounded by distractions, never at peace with himself. Hill would call this state mental inertia, the paralysis of the soul in the face of life's choice. How many of us aren't, in some way, trapped in this same underground? How many times have we said, "I don't know what I want," when in fact we're afraid to desire it? The underground man believes he is free because he can think whatever he wants, but his thoughts imprison him. He speaks of morality, science, and progress, but deep down he envies the simplicity of those who live without reflecting so much. He is too lucid to be happy and too proud to change. This paradox is at the heart of the human condition, and this is where Hill and Dostoevsky meet without knowing each other. Hill teaches that true freedom is born of mental discipline, while Dostoevsky shows the opposite, what happens when that discipline is lost. One lived to teach the path of the enlightened mind, the other to reveal the price of not following it. But there's something even deeper to this story. The underground man doesn't hate the world out of spite. He hates it because he fears. He hides from humanity as if he fears his own vulnerability. Hill would say, this is the instinct for self-protection in its most distorted form. The fear of surrender, of trust, of creating bonds. Because love is a loss of control. And those who live obsessed with control ultimately lose their meaning. How many times have you found yourself rationalizing feelings to avoid the risk of feeling? How many times have you traded a chance at joy for a calculation of safety? Dostoevsky reveals that the mind, when isolated, creates alternative realities, small prisons where pride reigns and the heart is silent. The underground man prefers to imagine a life of glory rather than face real life, with its imperfections and uncertainties. Hill would call this compensatory fantasy, when thought creates an illusory world to escape action. It's the same mechanism that makes someone promise change and never deliver, dream big and never take the step. The underground man lives in life's eternal rehearsal, unable to take the stage. But something surprising emerges from this chaos. In narrating his contradictions, character reveals a lucidity so brutal, it feels like a collective confession. He understands that man seeks suffering, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. But there is a hidden pleasure in pain. The pleasure of feeling something, anything, even if it hurts. Hill, with his practical vision, would say that this pleasure is the mind's addiction to negative frequencies, the attachment to the vibration of fear and guilt. Both are right. Suffering is an addiction when it doesn't generate transformation, but it is a miracle when the underground man knows that his conscience is a curse. He observes the world with irony, criticizes everyone, distrusts everyone. But deep down, he envies the purity of those who live without analyzing themselves too much. There is something tragic in this. The more intelligent a man becomes, further away from simplicity he becomes. And wisdom without love becomes despair. Hill, with his clear language, would translate this idea into a thought without purpose breeds self-destruction. With his bitter poetry, would say the same with another image. Man digs his own underground and then calls it home. Doesn't this metaphor still describe our times? People live surrounded by noise, yet feel alone. They have access to all knowledge, lose their meaning. They work excessively, but don't know why. They live in a gilded underground, illuminated by screens, but deliberately dark. The underground man is the portrait of a humanity saturated with stimuli, lacking a soul. Hill would warn that the mind without direction is the plaything of circumstance, and Dostoevsky would show that the soul without faith is an abyss that swallows reason itself. What the writer learned is that there is no escape without confrontation. Man must look to his own depths, not to escape them, but to traverse them. Only those who descend to the roots of pain understand what true freedom is. And it is at this point that Napoleon Hill reappears as a silent force within the narrative, the reminder that the mind can transform any hell into a school. No prison can resist the clarity of purpose. No shadow can survive the gaze of those who choose to understand. Dostoevsky, when writing Memories from Underground, didn't just want to expose human misery. He wanted to show that it is the starting point for transcendence. The soul, to awaken, must first recognize its own mire. Hill would say that failure is the cradle of wisdom. Dostoevsky proved that despair is the shortest path to God. Both spoke, each in their own way, of the same inner revolution. The moment when man stops running away and begins to face himself. And perhaps this is the secret that unites these two giants, separated by time and geography, but connected by the same mystery. The mind creates the world, but the heart gives it meaning. Reason builds the bridges, but it is faith that crosses. The underground man, in his anguish and lucidity, forces us to ask the question that drives every spiritual quest. To what extent is suffering a prison, and when does it become the gateway to freedom? The echo of this question travels through time and reaches us. Everyone, at some point, has been the underground man. We've all locked ourselves in our own thoughts, feared what we felt, and fled from ourselves. But perhaps what Dostoevsky and Hill are trying to tell us is that the way out isn't above, but ahead. in the next step, in the next choice, in the moment the mind decides to serve the heart, not dominate it. And at that very moment, the underground ceases to be a prison portal. They say that every man carries within himself a secret tribunal, and that sooner or later, this tribunal awakens to judge him. For Dostoevsky, this judgment came in the form of a novel, Crime and Punishment. It was 1866, and he was no longer just a writer, a survivor, a man who had seen death up close, felt the weight of chains, tasted the silence of solitude. He knew that evil is not born in the streets, but within ideas. He knew that every crime begins as a thought, and that every punishment is, first and foremost, mental. This was how Raskolnikov was, the young student who believed he could challenge the morality of the world, and who would eventually discover what Napoleon Hill would call the most implacable of laws: whatever the mind, it must itself confront. Raskolnikov believed himself to be extraordinary, a man above the rules, capable of killing for an idea, of committing a crime in the name of reason. He told himself that Napoleon also killed and was admired, that the great men of history have always gone beyond the limits of common morality. His plan was simple: kill an old moneylender and steal her money, then use it to help the poor. An act of rational sacrifice. But the human mind is not made of calculus. There are forces within it that escape logic. When Raskolnikov commits the crime, what is shattered is not the victim's body, but the balance of his own spirit. He discovers with astonishment that true hell begins when conscience awakes. Napoleon Hill, if he observed him, would say that Raskolnikov is the perfect example of the misdirected power of thought. He applied will, concentration, and purpose, same tools Hill would teach to create success. But he applied them without faith, without love, and without respect for life. And when thought is fueled by pride, it turns into poison. Raskolnikov believed he was in control. Every step he took brought him closer to ruin. The mind, which he thought he had mastered, began to rebel. Nightmares, fevers, visions. Guilt became a living, constant presence, like a shadow silently watching. What's striking is that Dostoevsky, when writing this story, was also living under pressure. He owed money, had tight deadlines, and suffered from epileptic seizures that left him on the brink of death. He wrote Crime and Punishment, feverish body and a heart. In a curious episode, he staked the rights to all his future works on a contract to make money. If he didn't deliver the new novel on time, he would lose everything. He dictated entire passages to a young stenographer named Anna Grigorievna, who would later become his wife and savior. The book was born on the border between despair and faith, precisely the space where Hill said the mind creates its miracles. While writing, Dostoevsky experienced the same conflict as character, the dilemma between reason and Raskolnikov. He projected his own struggle between pride and humanity. The young murderer believed he could justify evil with good, just as many justify small mistakes in the name of purposes. But the universe, Hill would say, accepts no shortcuts. Every action generates a corresponding reaction, and there is no deceiving the invisible laws of the mind. Raskolnikov's punishment comes not from the police or the court, from the solar burden that grows with every heartbeat. It's curious to note how Dostoevsky, unfamiliar with Hill's analogy, accurately describes the workings of mental vibrations. Raskolnikov lives under increasing tension because his thoughts betray him. He vibrates with guilt, and this vibration attracts him to the people and situations around him. Hill would call this the law of mental attraction. Dostoevsky would call it destiny. The result is the same. The mind creates the field of reality in which man moves. The turning point in the story comes when Raskolnikov meets Sonia, a young prostitute who, despite her poverty, maintains an unshakable purity. She represents silent faith, the love that endures even in the darkness. Unlike him, Sonia doesn't try to justify life. She simply lives, endures. Hill would say she is the embodiment of applied faith, the power of active belief that moves mountains. It is through her that Raskolnikov discovers the power of surrender. When he confesses to his crime, he does so not out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire for liberty. He understands that true freedom is not living without guilt, but living truthfully. There's an extraordinary moment in the novel when Sonia reads to him the biblical passage about the resurrection of Lazarus. One of the most symbolic moments in literature. What was dead within begins, and it's there that Hill and Dostoevsky meet again, as if in dialogue across the centuries. Hill taught that failure is always temporary, and that rebirth is possible when a person changes their frequency. Dostoevsky shows this transformation not in words, but in suffering. Repentance is the process by which the soul returns to the light. Interestingly, years later, scholars discovered that Dostoevsky wrote many of his texts in a near-trance state. He claimed that, before his epileptic seizures, he felt a kind of ecstasy and indescribable mental clarity, as if he had touched the very meaning of life. He said that in these moments he saw the harmony of the universe in a flash. It was as if For a few seconds, his mind accessed what Hill would call infinite intelligence. And it is this same ecstasy that he conveys at the end of Crime and Punishment, when Raskolnikov, lying on his prison bed, cries for the first time, not for himself. At that moment, he ceases to be a criminal, a human. Around Dostoevsky, Russia was teeming with change. Society lived between the advance of scientific reason, lapse of traditional faith. Progress promised liberation, but brought emptiness. Factories grew, ideals multiplied, but the meaning of existence faded. Dostoevsky saw all this and transformed the chaos into art. He understood that humanity's true problem was neither political nor economic, but spiritual. Hill, decades later, would confirm the same principle in different language. The failure of modern man is that he has no definite purpose. The public's fascination with Crime and Punishment, the novel wasn't just a crime story. It was a mirror. Each reader saw a bit of themselves in Raskolnikov, the rational justification, the disguised guilt, the desire to be greater than oneself. The book became a phenomenon because it touched the most sensitive point of the human soul, the conflict between the good one desires and the evil one practices. And Hill would explain this phenomenon by saying that every human mind vibrates in search of harmony, and that when faced with its own shadow, it recognizes all for balance. In a letter to a friend, Dostoevsky wrote that his goal was not to tell a detective story, but to explore the abyss of conscience. He said that crime is a metaphor for man's rebellion against God, and punishment, the process of returning to spiritual order. And in this cycle, each reader is invited to recognize themselves. After all, who hasn't crossed a line thinking they could handle the consequences? Who hasn't believed they could control something that, in the end, consumed them? Raskolnikov, in the end, understands that pride is the strongest prison in the world. He realizes that the true punishment is not being condemned, but being unable to love anymore. And when he finally surrenders to Sonia's love, the punishment becomes redemption. It's the lesson Napoleon Hill so often repeated. Love is the supreme creative force, the only one capable of neutralizing fear, healing guilt, realigning man with his purpose. Dostoevsky transformed his own suffering into universal wisdom. His entire life was a sequence of falls and rebirths, and with each rebirth, he brought new insight into the human soul. Crime and Punishment, not just a book about murder. It's a parable about the mind creating its own ruin and then learning to rebuild. A manual of self-knowledge written in blood and faith. And just when we think the story is over, we realize it isn't. Raskolnikov's judgment lives on in every person who reads the book and sees themselves reflected in it. Just as Hill believed that every thought leaves an energetic trail in the universe, Dostoevsky believed that every written word is a thread connecting consciousnesses. Crime and Punishment remains alive as it continues to be read, felt. It is the eternal mirror of human conflict, perhaps the reminder that all guilt is a wake-up call. Dostoevsky ended the novel as one would end a confession, but his journey was far from over. He had understood that evil is not an isolated error, but rather a language, a twisted way of seeking meaning. And this understanding would lead him to his most ambitious work, one in which he would explore not only the guilt of one man, but the spiritual destiny of all humans. On the horizon, the author already saw the silhouette of a new, where angels and demons would mingle in the faces of Karamazov brothers. And Napoleon Hill, like an invisible mentor, seemed to whisper between the pages, "He who conquers himself has no enemies." When Dostoevsky began writing, the brothers, Karamazov, had already crossed all the frontiers of the human spirit. He had experienced prison, poverty, fame, and failure. He knew what guilt was and what forgiveness was. And now he wanted something great to understand the soul of the world. He wanted to discover why man, even knowing what good is, continues to choose evil. This question haunted him for years, until it became the novel that many consider his masterpiece. He said that it condensed his entire life, the blood, the faith, the doubts, and the scars. Napoleon Hill, if he could observe him, would say that Dostoevsky had reached the pinnacle of human development, mastery of the mind through self-knowledge. The book begins with a family in ruins, corrupt, debauched, selfish father, for sons who hate him for different reasons. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, symbol of humanity when it loses its moral direction. He lives only for pleasure and money, mocking everything sacred. He is like the mind when it disconnects from consciousness, a body without. And his sons represent the fragments of this broken soul. Dmitri, the eldest, is pure impulse. He lives driven by desires, passions, and jealousy. Ivan is the intellectual, man of cold reason who doubts God and believes that he doesn't exist, anything is permitted. Alyosha, the youngest, is the opposite, a monk who tries to see goodness even in the darkness. And then there is Smerdyakov, the bastard son, the servant who lives in the shadow of others, harboring resentment, envy. Dostoevsky thus constructs a scenario in which crime ceases to be merely an act. The murder of his father is not only the center of the plot, it is a symbolic representation of what happens when man kills the idea of the divine within himself. Hill would call this the destruction of the higher purpose, the moment when the mind abandons spiritual guidance and surrenders to self-sufficiency. Fyodor Karamazov dies at the hands of what he created, a lack of love, and his children become the reflection of his choices. The tension builds like a rope being stretched to its limit. Each character believes they are right, but all wrong. Dmitri is accused of the crime. Ivan is consumed by guilt. Alyosha struggles to maintain faith in the fate of tragedy. Human justice reveals itself to be fragile, confused, incapable of distinguishing truth from appearance. And deep down, the reader realizes what Dostoevsky wanted to show. The real judgment does not take place in the courts, but within the mind of each person. Hill would say that this is the point at which thought reveals creative power, because every idea, good or bad, shapes the destiny of the one who nurtures. There's an almost supernatural moment in the narrative. Ivan, overcome by fever and delirium, has a vision of the devil, not a monster, but an ordinary man, dressed in simple clothes and with a tired smile. They talk at length, and the devil taunts him with irony and intelligence. "You speak of freedom," he says, "but man cannot bear to be free. He prefers to bow before something, even if it is a lie." This scene is one of the most powerful moments in all of literature, because it conveys a truth that Hill also taught in another form, that the mind, without purpose and discipline, becomes a slave to negative influence. Evan believes he is master of his ideas, as their prisoner. What makes this part of the story even more fascinating is Alyosha's silent presence. While the others struggle with chaos, he remains serene, even in the face of suffering. He is the living portrait of faith that cannot be explained, felt. He doesn't try to prove anything, simply embraces. Hill would call this the strength of positive vibration, the power of peace. Alyosha doesn't conquer evil through logic, but through compassion, and almost invisibly his presence begins to heal others. Dmitri, the impulsive, finds the courage to admit his mistakes. Ivan, the rational, realizes that his intelligence without love is destroying him. Even Shmertikov, the servant who carries the weight of lies, understands too late that hatred is the darkest prison. A curious fact is that Dostoevsky wrote the book in just 2 years, already ill and exhausted, while facing constant crises. He believed he wouldn't live long enough to finish it, yet he wrote each page with sacred urgency. He told his wife he was dictating the will of humanity. And, in a way, he was. The Brothers Karamazovs, the final summary of everything he has learned about the human mind and heart. That man is capable of the worst cruelties and the most sublime gestures, and that both forces inhabit the same body. The novel also anticipates ideas that would only be understood decades later. Freud's psychology, Sartre's existentialism, Nietzsche's philosophy, all of this is already there, between the lines. Dostoevsky saw the human being as a field of conflicting energy, a constant duality between faith and despair, between guilt and redemption. Hill, observing from afar in time, would reinforce the same thesis. Man lives between two mental poles, the positive and the negative, and his life depends on which one he chooses to nourish. As the story progresses, tension mounts. Dmitri is tried, convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Ivan goes mad with the weight of Alyosha, alone, keeps the flame of hope alive. The reader feels each person's anguish, but also the possibility of transformation, because amidst the tragedy, there are glimmers of light. Dostoevsky wanted to show that even in the mud, there is a spark of purity, and that redemption is not a distant promise. It is a choice that can be made now, any moment. Most impressively, even in the face of so much suffering, the ending doesn't bring despair. Alyosha gathers a group of children and speaks to them about love, about the importance of remembering the good times, even when life is hard. This simple, almost silent scene ends the story on a note of serenity. The man who descended into the abyss ends by speaking of tenderness. Hill would say, this is the pinnacle of the creative mind, when the individual understands that true power lies not in domination, but in service. By this time, Dostoevsky was no longer just a writer. He had become a messenger of what Hill would call universal wisdom, the conviction that good and evil are not external forces battling each other, but internal choices repeated daily. And that man's destiny is determined by what he thinks and feels when no one is looking. When published, The Brothers Karamazov in 1880, Dostoevsky knew he had completed his mission. His health was failing, but his soul was at peace. He had written not a novel, a kind of revelation, a map of human consciousness. In the silence after the last page, The reader understands that he has read not just about a Russian family, but about himself. Because we are all, to some degree, a Karamazov of part reason, part faith, part shadow, part... Ultimately, Dostoevsky and Napoleon Hill were saying the same thing in different languages, that man is the creator of his own reality, and that hell or heaven begins within his... The brothers Karamazovits, a reminder that there is no victory without confrontation, no peace with self-mastery. And perhaps that's why, to this day, anyone who reads this book feels like they're facing something that's watching them back, as if their own consciousness were asking, which side of your mind have you been living on? And when that question echoes, there's no turning back. The viewer, like the brothers, has already entered the zone where thought creates destiny. And it is precisely there, between the fall and the awakening, that the true ending begins. The one Dostoevsky would write not with ink, but with his own life. Some say life is a succession of coincidences, but Dostoevsky proved otherwise, that there is an invisible order guiding everything, even that which seems like ruin. And that within every fall, there is always a spark of new beginning. When he died in 1881, at the age of 59, the world lost a man, but gained an eternal voice. He departed as a Russian writer, but remained a messenger of the human soul. He left behind not only books, but mirrors, and those who look into them carefully realize that the reflection is their own. Napoleon Hill, upon reading the laws that govern thought, perhaps felt the same, that man is not just a body living in time, but a mind that shapes reality. Both, on different paths, reached the same conclusion, that true freedom is internal, and that the greatest human power is to decide what to think, even when all seems lost. Throughout his life, Dostoevsky saw hell and redemption, and at each extreme he discovered the same truth. The mind is the stage where fate is written. He understood that suffering is not punishment, but an invitation. That pain, when accepted consciously, transforms into wisdom. That failure is merely a pause for the soul's maturation. Napoleon Hill said that every defeat carries with it the seed of an equivalent benefit. Dostoevsky lived this literally. Imprisoned, condemned to death, humiliated, betrayed, sick, poor, and yet, he produced the most luminous literature in history. Not because he ignored pain, but because he immersed himself in it until he found the truth hidden behind every fear. He discovered that man is neither good nor evil, but a battlefield between two forces, one that elevates him and the other that destroys him. What determines the victor is what he chooses to cultivate silently when no one is watching. It is in this invisible choice that destiny is formed. Hill asserted that thoughts are causes and conditions are mere acts. Dostoevsky demonstrated this in practice. The same man who lived among criminals and the desperate was able to find God within the mud. The same man who lost everything was able to be reborn from his own guilt. The secret lay in the way he thought, and above all, in the way he loved. The human mind is a living. It builds what it believes, attracts what it feels, and creates what it imagines. When a person decides to change their thinking, they change their vibration, and everything around them begins to reorganize itself. This isn't mysticism, it's a law as exact as gravity. Hill called it the law of mental cause and effect. Dostoevsky described it by another name, faith. Both knew that faith is not blind belief, but a firm direction of consciousness. It's choosing to look up, even when the ground is cracking. It's transforming hopelessness into... How many times have you felt trapped in a cycle of pain, repeating the same story, carrying old guilt, waiting for something to change from the outside? Dostoevsky and Hill remind us that nothing changes from the outside, and something changes inside. Transformation begins the moment you decide to observe your thoughts and realize that you are not them. You are the one who chooses what to think. And it is in this choice that lies the freedom that no government, no prison, no circumstance can take away. When humankind understands this, everything reorganizes. The mind ceases to be an enemy and becomes an instrument. Suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes language. Life ceases to be chaos and becomes a process. Dostoevsky used to say that a man is only worthy of admiration when he kneels and weeps, not out of weakness, because in that moment he recognizes his humanity. It is when pride dissolves that wisdom is born. Hill said the same thing in other words. Humility is the gateway to learning. Both understood that the most powerful force in the universe is the ability to rise again. Because success, in the end, isn't about never falling. It's about always rising. Imagine for a moment if every person watching this video decided to apply this truth to their day. If each person, upon waking, chose a single positive thought to sustain throughout the day. If each person decided to transform fear into courage, doubt into faith, guilt into action, the world would be different. Hill said that the human mind is a broadcasting and that each thought emits a frequency that reaches other minds. This means that when you change, the world around you changes too. When you elevate your thought pattern, you become a kind of silent light, able to influence your surroundings without saying a word. Dostoevsky believed that the meaning of life is not happiness, but spiritual growth. Hill would conclude by saying that this growth is achieved through the practical application of thought. This means acting on what one believes, not just believing. It means forgiving even when unwilling, thanking even when unjustified, persisting even when unreasonable. It is this interaction, repeated day after day, that transforms the mind into an ally. Suffering does not disappear, but changes location. It ceases to be an enemy, becomes a master. Dostoevsky's death was peaceful. He knew he had fulfilled his purpose. Minutes before he passed, he read to his wife the gospel passage always moved him. Unless a grain of wheat dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. It was the last thing he said, and it sums up everything he taught. Man must die to fear, pride, and the illusion of control if he is to be. Hill would translate this same idea into practical language. Turn defeat into seed, and it will become harvest. And perhaps this is where the two visions merge. The path of the mind and the path of faith are the same. Dostoevsky showed the emotional journey. Hill showed the rational method. One descended into the hell of the soul, the other built stairs to escape. And both left the same message. Victory lies not in conquering the world, but in conquering oneself. Now, given all that has been said, what will you do with this? Keep it as an inspiring story, or transform it into a living practice? The choice is yours. Start small. Choose today a thought that uplifts, an attitude that heals, a gesture that inspires. Do something, even if no one sees. Apply the wisdom of Dostoevsky and Hill to your daily life, in the way you speak, the way you react, the way you dream. Train your mind to see opportunity where there is pain, because the mind is the mirror of the universe. Everything you see outside begins within. If this journey touched you in any way, if it awakened something silent within you, a memory, a desire, a strength, please leave it on record. Write in the comments, even anonymously. Share what you felt, because each word of yours could be what another heart needs to read today. Like the video if it inspired you, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of awareness and transformation. Here, we don't just talk about ideas, we talk about real life, power that arises when the mind awakens and the heart decides to act. And remember, as long as there's a thought of faith in your mind, there's a new beginning waiting for you.